Thanks everyone for joining. Maybe just before we start, we're quite a small group, so I don't want to pick on anyone, but does anybody want to move maybe down towards the front a little bit so we're in a slightly closer... Yeah, today I'm going to talk about collaborative decision making for anticipatory humanitarian action. So, collaborative decision making in terms of how we work across sectors and have that real multi-sectoral collaboration to be able to make risk-informed decisions about when we do or don't allocate funding ahead of a crisis. So as I said before, I will talk about Start Network in a bit more detail later on and provide a bit more context for that. But just to quickly introduce myself again, for those who are already here. So my name's Milli. I'm the Technical Partnerships Advisor for Crisis Anticipation and Risk Financing at Start Network. And we also have Alice on the line from Clear Global, who will be giving a bit of a presentation later on, and will also introduce herself then. So just to start, I was going to do a bit of an energizer. We've all just had lunch. Everyone's maybe feeling a bit sleepy. So just a quick word association, just going around the room, one by one, just for the word warning. I didn't realise this was going to be live streamed, so this isn't interactive, apologies. So maybe just super quickly around the room. But maybe if I start over here with Kevin. Sorry, Kevin. If you just want to, first word you think of that comes to mind with warning, and then Marianne will go on to you, and then just go along like that. Just get everyone involved. Off you go. Warning.
Important.
Fast onset.
Okay.
Prepared.
Information.
Okay.
Trust. Collaboration.
Great.
Communication.
Great.
Forecast.
Fab.
Fear.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with uncertainty.
Uncertainty, good one, yeah.
Accuracy.
Okay. Any word?
I'm going to start repeating what other people say. Communication.
Communication, sure, great.
Engagement.
Brilliant. Trouble, yep.
Coordination.
Coordination, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think everything's been said.
No problem.
Hurry.
Hurry, yep.
Risk.
Great. Dissemination, fab. Authority, brilliant. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for humouring me with that. Hopefully you're all feeling a little bit more alert and aware now. Okay, so maybe just to talk a little bit about the session outcomes, what we're expecting to get out of the next sort of hour and a half or so. As I said, we're going to look at how collaboration between humanitarian actors and risk experts can unlock anticipatory financing for dynamic risks. So we're particularly thinking about, in the current landscape, we see a lot of anticipatory action financing models that are really based on pre-agreed financing, pre-agreed thresholds based on models. So where within that landscape is the scope to be able to finance warnings for those who are vulnerable to the impacts of hazards that fall outside of these models or outside of these mechanisms? So where we have hazards that can't be modelled, or places where we don't have the data to be able to model yet, or maybe we'll never have that data, or even just places where we don't have these mechanisms yet. So thinking about the gaps in this system that's beginning to emerge of that automatically triggered funding. Second, we're going to be thinking about what kind of warning do traditional humanitarian actors produce when they're requesting funding before a hazard occurs. How can these warnings be used to finance and to generate action? And what kind of information might be missing from their requests? Thinking about where their expertise lies, what information might be missing from their requests for funding, and how can they be strengthened? Third, thinking about, and this comes to the uncertainty session that I was in this morning, which was excellent, when decision makers for humanitarian financing receive funding requests that are missing that high quality validated information that comes from having a really clear analysis background, how can we increase confidence for decision makers who might not know how to assess uncertainty and how to manage uncertainty? And what has Start Network learned about making this kind of decision about financing based on these warnings that don't have that strong technical analysis behind them? So, spoiler alert, the answer is multi-sectoral collaboration, as you probably guessed, but really looking at the relationship between humanitarian actors and decision makers, and risk analysts, scientists, academics, and hazard experts. So today we're going to have a bit of a taster of how that multi-sectoral collaboration can work, and we're going to have a bit of a live decision-making scenario as well, so be ready to get involved and get your thinking hats on. So I said I was going to talk a bit more about Start Network. Who are we and what do we do? So Start Network is a membership organisation of more than 80 local, national and international non-governmental organisations. And our mission, our vision is based on the premise that the current humanitarian system as it is not fit for purpose. And particularly for this conference and for the work that my team does, the system is reactive rather than proactive. What does this mean? It means that even when a hazard event can be foreseen, financing isn't released until after we start seeing the impacts. This means that humanitarian response arrives late and after situations have become crises. So what does this look like? In terms of before the disaster strikes, we have poor preparedness and planning, underinvestment in data and systems for response, and we have a situation where people aren't acting or aren't able to act on warnings. After the event, we're seeing really slow, politicised decision-making. We're seeing a fragmented and poorly coordinated response, and we're also seeing that funding has to be raised first and often very slowly before making its way through to where it's really needed. So we'll probably see, in relation to the event that happened in Morocco over the weekend, we'll slowly start to see these big funding appeals coming through. But that means already a number of days, hours, weeks even, sometimes months have already passed. So what if funding could be released earlier and we could mitigate the impacts of these crises and potentially save many lives and also save a lot of money? At Start Network, we really think that this can be done by shifting to a more proactive and anticipatory response. So moving from receiving a warning, having little to no or slow reaction, people being affected and spending a lot of money on response, to receiving a warning, acting early, saving lives and hopefully saving costs and also protecting those development gains. So, anticipatory action, a definition. So this is the G7 definition from the recent glossary for early anticipatory action. And basically says anticipatory action is defined as acting ahead of predicted hazardous events to prevent or reduce acute humanitarian impacts before they fully unfold. So we're really looking at preventing the impact of an event rather than preventing the event from occurring. This includes two types of anticipatory action, and I think this broader definition is useful for this reason. We have the sort of forecast-based financing pre-arranged mechanisms that I spoke about a little bit before that are based on triggered funding that's released automatically according to model-based triggers. And these have guaranteed funding behind them, so the modelling has to be really very robust in those kind of mechanisms. But the second type of anticipatory action that's talked about a little bit less is anticipatory action for more dynamic risks and taking more dynamic approaches. So looking at how human decision-making can have an impact and how human decision-making can be based on risk information that's sometimes qualitative and often in rapidly changing situations that models aren't able to process. This aligns with the Start Network definition of anticipatory action. So here's a bit of a timeline or a spectrum, if you like, for people who prefer a more visual approach. Start Network defines anticipatory action as proactively responding to increasing risks before the peak of a crisis to support communities to prepare and reduce the likelihood of harm or loss. So looking at the spectrum, you have the disaster risk reduction elements, which come way before a disaster, kind of ongoing development work. And that's things like installing flood defences, improving your water drainage systems, building cyclone-resilient houses. In the anticipation phase, this comes after the early warning, but before the disaster actually occurs. So it's things like advanced preparedness to respond, doing rapid protection training before an election that's expected to become violent, mitigating loss and harm by communicating and mobilising interventions before a heat wave, and avoiding losses, so things like destocking livestock before a drought that's expected to occur. And these are the kind of actions that you will take once you have a certain level of confidence that something is actually going to happen, because it requires some level of investment, some level of change in what you're doing. Then the rest of the spectrum probably people are quite familiar with in terms of emergency response, that's the urgent mobilisation, and then recovery and reconstruction. So, apologies for this slightly scary slide. Realistically, what is the potential for anticipatory action and how significant can this shift really be? So according to recent research by ODI, around half of the combined amounts that were allocated to disasters through the SURF rapid response mechanism and the start fund mechanism, in theory, it would be possible to forecast the event ahead of time and act earlier in the evolution of crisis to mitigate impacts. So we can see here, there's around 50% of all humanitarian crises fall within that window of potential for anticipatory action. Looking slightly higher up, around 20% of this 50%, so kind of a funny statistic, but 20 of the 50% are highly predictable, meaning that they could potentially be modelled and have pre-arranged financing set up for them. But looking at this row below, actually, we see that a further 30% of risks we currently have limited potential to model. This means it's very, very difficult to set up that pre-arranged financing. But they are still potentially forecastable, which means there is still that potential to act before they occur. And yet, I think these figures change, but it's a very low figure. Anyway, around 1 to 2% of all humanitarian funding is allocated ahead of identified crisis risk. So really the potential is quite significant. We're looking at around 50% of crises that can be forecast, but only 1 to 2% actually receiving that funding ahead of time. So for this session, as I said, we're going to particularly focus on that 30% of funding. It's going to events that are forecastable, but they have the limited potential to be modelled. How can we release financing to generate action in these situations? So at Start Network, we have 2 financing mechanisms that are available to our NGO membership. Both of these can be used for anticipatory action in the 2 senses that we saw in the definition of anticipatory action. We have Start Ready on the right there, and that's the style of mechanism that we're seeing increasingly at the moment. So we see Red Cross, WFP, FAO are all using this automated pre-arranged funding released on the basis of a threshold being met. But you'll see on the left here, we also have the Start Fund, and the Start Fund is a pooled fund for small to medium scale under the radar events. So the events that were kind of being mentioned, if anybody was in the opening talk this morning, we have the big headline events, but every day there are these smaller things going on. This fund is governed by human decision making based on information that's often qualitative. The fund is owned by Start Network members, i.e. humanitarian actors, and they are responsible for making the decisions about allocating funding based on alerts that are raised by NGOs in the country where the crisis is expected to occur. How can the Start Fund be used for anticipation? So the Start Fund anticipation window actually enables members to act before a crisis turns into a disaster, so before the impacts are felt. For example, funding can be released through the Start Fund on the basis of a weather forecast that predicts heavy flooding, or on the basis of local media that points to potential political unrest. The Start Fund anticipation window was established in November 2016, and it was the first NGO funding mechanism to be available for anticipatory interventions. And it's based on 3 key principles. So the monitoring of both modelable and unmodelled risks, collaborative risk analysis, and NGO-owned decision-making. And this is for 3 different types of humanitarian need: underfunded, small to medium-scale crises, spikes in chronic crises, so in an ongoing situation if we're expecting a new peak, and forecasts of impending crises. So anticipation in and of itself, it's not a new concept, it's a way of working for many people. But this is not consistent, and it's not always with access to the funding that's needed to generate action. So, collaborative risk analysis, this is a really key feature in the decision making for the fund, and we're going to explore that decision making in a bit more detail. So I'll walk us through it, but we're going to get a little bit more interactive in just a moment. So, how does this mechanism work for releasing funding ahead of these crises that can be forecast but can't be modelled? The maximum timeline from alert to disbursement is 72 hours, and we're going to do a test run of the allocation decision. And you can see here we have the anticipation alert just before that alert section at the top, and that's really where the risk analysis is happening within our NGO members. They're looking at what's happening on the ground and understanding what is likely to occur in the coming future. They raise the alert at 0 hours, which means submitting an alert note with details about the expected people to be affected, the expected forecast date for the peak of the impact, what the impacts will be, and kind of what is going to happen. 24 hours later, the allocation decision is made by NGO members. So this is obviously a very short window for gathering information and making a decision. After that, we go through into proposal submission and project selection and implementation. But it's important to remember that each project is a maximum of 60 days, but usually around 45 days. So here we have a financing mechanism that can release funding without a pre-agreed threshold. And we have warnings that can be raised by humanitarian actors who are closest to the context where the impacts of the hazard are expected to be felt. But the pot of money that we have is not limitless. We have to make decisions about how we can spend this effectively. So how do the NGO decision makers go about allocating funding in a responsible way? And how, when they have just 24 hours to process all of this information? And how do they have confidence that the funding that they are allocating will have an impact and, more importantly, do no harm? So that's the allocation decision there that we're going to go into. So just to explain how these decisions are made a little bit, to assess alert notes, decision makers have a set of critical questions that the START network has developed to try and identify whether an alert meets the niche of small to medium scale underfunded crises, a peak in an ongoing chronic crisis, or a forecast crisis. And this is aiming to try and clarify the impact that a small amount of funding can actually have. So, as I said, we're really thinking about small-scale situations or gap filling in a much bigger situation. And start fund alerts can be raised for up to £1 million, but usually we're looking at alerts for around 300,000 GBP. And increasingly, we're seeing really targeted alerts for between 50 and 100k. So that's a much smaller amount than kind of the big releases of funding that you sometimes see. So looking at the first question, the crisis profile, really thinking about what's the scale of the forecasted situation? How big are we expecting this impact to be? How many people? Geographically, what's the scale? What are the expected impacts? Timeliness. So as I said, funding is released within 72 hours. We're one of the fastest funding mechanisms around. We usually see response alerts within a week. Any later than this, we're asking why that's going to be delayed. So we're really thinking, why does this funding needed right now within the next 2 days? So when thinking about, what is the usefulness of having that fast funding mechanism? Government capacity and other responses. So is the government already responding? Are there other actors already responding? Have they requested international assistance? Do they even need it? If there is existing capacity, any kind of start-funded action should be complementary and coordinated with whatever else is going on in that country at the moment. Potential and future funding is really looking at what the funding landscape looks like in the upcoming weeks and months. Start fund is often used as bridge funding, so to cover essential gaps while slower, bigger funding comes online. And sometimes, as I said before, this can be up to several months after the event actually occurs. Crisis visibility. So funding, start fund funding is intended for events that are under the radar, and sometimes media attention can be indicative of the expected funding that might come online later on, but not always. Gaps. So in larger scale situations, funds should clearly be filling identified gaps. These gaps could be in time, so before other funding comes online, or it could be in terms of sector, in terms of the targeted groups, or in terms of the geography. The implementation period. So bearing in mind 45 days is the length of time for a project. What happens after this point? Who are you handing over to? What's the impact going to be within 45 days? The coverage rate is asking yourself whether the requested funding is going to be sufficient to meet the needs of the people who are identified as within the scope of that alert. Is it going to stretch far enough to cover all of those needs? And if the number of people in the scope of the alert isn't the full number of people likely to be affected, how and why have you chosen those people to be within the scope of the alert? And this shouldn't be on the basis of where the agencies that are raising the alert are where they're active and where they're based. Last one then, disbursement capacity. So the start fund funds are usually limited. So what's in the pot that's available to be dispersed, we're usually running between £1 and £2 million at any given point in time. So how do you know that these funds are going to be impactful? What you're giving now is potentially meaning that you can't respond to a later alert. For anticipation alerts, we have two further criteria. So one is the quality of the risk analysis. So really looking at where the situation is being described. Is this a high quality forecast? How do we know that this is likely to happen? Has the raising agency considered that there might be some level of uncertainty in that forecast? And then the second one is the anticipation implementation period, which basically means if this funding is released, is there enough time to actually do anticipatory actions before the impacts are felt, or are we running already into response? Thinking about those in a bit more detail then, the risk analysis needs to look at the timing. So is the alert close enough to the peak of the hazard to have a robust forecast? The credibility, so asking yourself, where's this forecast come from? How do we know it's reliable, and can it be triangulated? And can we rate the skill of the forecast? And then impacts, is there a demonstrated understanding of the potential impacts that this hazard could have? And what's that based on? then, as I said, the implementation period is really about, is there enough lead time? We often see blended anticipation and response alerts, given that 45 days out, you usually don't have a reliable forecast. But action should really be focused on mitigating the impact of the hazard before the peak for an anticipation alert. So let's give it a go. Is everyone feeling fairly confident with that decision-making framework that I've just introduced to you in about 5 minutes? We've had an alert come in anticipation of an Ebola outbreak in Apple country. The date is today, and you're working for an NGO, and you're part of the Start Fund decision-making rota. You've received an alert that's been raised in anticipation of an Ebola outbreak in Apple country, and you need to decide whether or not you're going to allocate funding. So, some information about this alert. It's been raised by 6 Start Network member organisations, or NGOs, who are in anticipation of Ebola outbreak. The amount that they've requested for early response, or early action, anticipatory action, is 250,000 GBP, but there's only 750,000 GBP left in the Start Fund pot. So you're going to be allocating around a third of the remaining pot for the next 2 months. Oh, that was not supposed to come up next, but that's fine. 85,540 people are forecast to be affected who are covered by this alert note, so that's where the actions will be targeted. But out of a 3 million total population expected to be impacted. I'm not sure why these are coming in this order. So the province and the scope of the alert is Area 11. And accessibility, there is travel between regions that is currently unrestricted and completely accessible by road. The forecast peak period, so from the alert being raised today, today's date is the 11th of September, the forecasted peak period is the 19th of September to the 1st of November 2023. So this is when we're expecting most of the impacts to be starting to be felt, or being peak felt. And the optimal period for anticipatory action is starting from the 15th of September and running to the 18th of October. Great, that's right at the bottom. So school children have been identified as a particularly vulnerable group due to the high number of day schools in Area 11. So this information is all going to come up on the next slide as well. I'm going to give you a bit more, but it will come back. So in terms of the context and what's happening at the moment, so on the 31st of July, the health authorities of Apple country declared an outbreak of Ebola. And as of the 31st of August, the Ministry of Health is reporting 129 confirmed cases in 7 districts. There have been 37 deaths so far and 43 recoveries. And since the 31st of August, that 1 new case has been confirmed in Area 15 on August the 31st, after a period of 37 days with no cases at all. If you choose to allocate funds, the NGO members have told us that they will use these for awareness campaigns in schools and town centres, and they'll do that by releasing radio messages and using information, education and communication materials. And the Apple country government has actually established a national rapid response team already, and they're investigating suspicious deaths. They've mobilised and coordinated responses across the districts that have seen confirmed cases, and they're primarily responding through PPE provision and training for key health workers. So just as a reminder, along the top is those first few stats from that first slide, so the number of people affected, the expected peak date, the amount that they've requested, the area and the kind of travel situation. And then along the bottom, a little reminder of the different things to consider when trying to make a decision about whether to allocate this funding or not. So, over to you. I think we've got around 10-15 minutes. Have a think, about whether or not you'd like to allocate funding to this. Maybe work in small groups if there's like 2 or 3 of you together. But really think about, yes, whether you'll allocate the funding or not, but also think about what other information would you like to see to make this decision. What information is missing? What would make you feel more confident about making that decision? So, yeah, over to you guys. Turn to your partner and have a chat. Great, I'm going to take advantage of that natural lull in conversation that just happened to bring everybody back. So, I don't know, is everyone feeling like they're kind of approaching a bit of a decision? They've got ideas of the kind of thing that they might want to get more information about? Seemed like it a bit. So what I'm going to do now is actually just ask everybody. So hopefully you've all come to a choice on whether you're going to allocate 250 GBP or not. So maybe if I just go round, maybe if we just do it like hands up rather than going around the room. Hands up who's going to, maybe actually I'm going to say who's going to say no first so that people don't feel shamed into saying. Okay, great. So we've got a really good spread of no's. Yeah, no, and it's super important that we have that kind of really critical reflection on whether or not to allocate that funding. So who was left who would still allocate? Who's deciding to allocate the funding? Yeah, confident yes over here. Yeah, group in the middle. Brilliant, great, nice. Can are there any volunteers to maybe just talk about what kind of information people felt like they were missing? Yeah, I don't know, I think we maybe need a...
That's fine, you heard me.
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
Just for the online audience.
Okay.
Is it this one of these, maybe? Oh, sorry, okay. Yeah, there we go, thanks.
So we weren't saying no end all. We were saying no, we would like more information on their plan, so the forecasting behind it. So actually, where were they? Because it seemed a little bit at odds with some of the latest information on the figures and that and the recovery and so on. And also then what was their, so they seemed to be doing a lot of communicating with it, but we weren't actually sure what the money was going to achieve. And it was a big sum of money for a small proportion of the population. We then didn't know how were they going to measure the effect that that communicating had. So we would like some more detail on that.
Great, thank you. I think at the back there, there's some more information required.
So we had two things that we were sort of really focused on. One was more of a risk analysis to understand better, because neither one of us are in the public health field. So,
Sure.
you know, more information about what the predicted impact of the virus would be, sort of, you know, how many people are we expecting to be exposed, you know, those sorts of things. But also, I think one of the big questions we had was whether or not was about your sort of how you determine funding in terms of competitive asks. Like, do you have multiple proposals at the same time? And are you trying to determine whether this one or this one gets the funding? And I think that's a really big consideration, because if you can see more impact from a different one, you know, are they all sort of judged on their own individual merit, or do you have to make, you know, comparative decisions?
Great, yeah, thanks. Maybe just to respond to that second question, which is maybe more about the mechanism, they should each be judged on their own merit, but obviously I think decision makers will always have in the back of their mind there is a potential hypothetical future situation that could arise, and we have a restricted amount of funding that can't grow bigger just because this one is also worth it. So really great questions, yeah, thank you. Yeah, at the back there. Oh, yeah, wherever.
Yeah, hi. So we also voted on the no.
Yeah.
And some information that we were missing was not so much in the forecasting and the modeling, but more in the demographics. So sounds quite simple, but is it an island?
Yeah.
How many shared borders? Are they natural?
Brilliant.
What's the movement of the people like? And more importantly, was there past outbreak? Is there lived experience within the communities? And would awareness campaigns achieve anything useful within this specific context? So those were some of the things that we were thinking about.
Fantastic, thank you, yeah.
Thanks.
I think, yeah.
Thank you. We were mixed a little with our decision, but we all agreed that we needed more information on kind of the transmission and data around that, because it seemed a little bit odd to us that the last new case reported was August 31st. Does that mean that there haven't been any new cases reported, or is there just an issue with reporting, and have there been any new cases? And also, how are I think it was, I don't remember how many total cases there were, 129. How are those cases being dealt with or mitigated or reduced in other districts? And kind of the relationship with the other districts with Area 11? Is there, I mean, I knew there was unrestricted travel, but are those cases in the 7 districts being quarantined? Or do they have free access to Area 11 or other areas that could increase transmission? And then we also wanted more information on the cultural response to Ebola. So that kind of goes in with the previous colleague. And a little bit more data on what actions would be taken. I know that it would be awareness campaigns, but how would that logistically, I know there would be radio messages, but will there be movement among the NGOs representative going into Area 11, and do they have enough PPE protection? Yeah.
Yeah, fab. Thank you. Any other? Yeah, go for it.
I think we said yes, but to make a decision, I mean, we understood that, I mean, there is a specific request from the national government, so there is a humanitarian need and a formal declaration, and we all know that these governments, like in Apple country, to make that alert is very difficult. So we understand that they have those forecasts and everything. To make a decision ourselves to support our members in implementing projects, we would like to know better the level of engagement with national authorities and local authorities to make sure that the training that we are going to deliver and the PPE provision is going to be effective. Basically that was the kind of information we were missing, the level of engagement with local authorities, national authorities and communities as well.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. Any other additions? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just to add on everyone's point about just gaining some more information, I think it's also important to see a little bit of a breakdown of kind of where they got that amount from. Because if it's a third of what we have available, and if the goal of the funding is clearly, it's not very multifaceted, it's kind of just awareness and communication, as well as the population that's being targeted is not that much, right? Like obviously in relation to all of that, I think is the funding that they're asking for proportionate to the goal. And if they could break that down, or if could they reach maybe a smaller number that could be accommodated for better.
Great, thank you. Yeah. I forgot. Maybe if we come here first, and then I might move forward.
Okay, we also had this discussion around information, obviously. We decided to vote for yes. And I just want to be a little bit the devil's advocate in the sense that, we do need more information, it's true, but we are also talking about emergency. And some countries or some places, they might not have the capacity to collect those information. This doesn't mean they are not in need.
Yeah. Brilliant.
You know, so it's like, it's an emergency situation, and how do you prioritize an emergency over another is a big challenge. But at the same time, you have to understand that if you are not good at collecting data, doesn't mean that you're not good at running an emergency situation.
Yeah, fantastic observation. Yeah, thank you.
Again, also we thought that it would be really relevant to know the level of security.
Definitely.
It is feasible to deliver all that support. Knowing again that this is a group of NGOs that trust each other, so logically they trust that the funds are going to be well used.
Yeah.
So that's
great, thank you. I might wrap up there, so if I just grab this. Oh, yeah, sure.
We had questions about the coverage rate, and we were wondering what that normally looks like for Start Network projects, what the number of indirect beneficiaries might be. So if you target this number of people who might kind of get that information indirectly as well. And we also had questions around the country's health system and its strengths and weaknesses, and how an information campaign could align with those as well.
Great, yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, I think those are all really great observations, and what I was really hoping to get out of this is to really show actually it's very hard to make this kind of decision, particularly if you're an NGO that's maybe not got the background in health that others might have. So it's really thinking about, you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty in this kind of alert note that's coming from NGO members who are maybe raising this alert and not filling in those information gaps particularly well. So lacking this kind of data it causes what we call epistemic uncertainty, which we often see, as I say, when we're receiving this kind of warning from humanitarian actors. So unlike risk, which is measurable, it's predictable, and outcomes can be understood in terms of probabilities. Uncertainty refers to the kind of situations where we actually can't know probabilistically what the outcome might be. So, for example, if we're anticipating potential violence or conflict ahead of an election, start fund members might identify different scenarios, but it's very difficult or not possible even to say exactly how likely it is that each of those different scenarios will come true. So epistemic uncertainty occurs when you don't have enough information or when you don't have the right information. So it's knowledge-based, and it's due to, like, as I say, not having enough information and not being able to estimate the effects of what we have in front of us. And this can be reduced by collecting more data. As you've all really accurately acknowledged, there's a lot of missing data from, obviously it's also a simulation, so it's a bit less detailed than it would be, but even in the full alert notes, we're often missing this kind of information that can help us to really make an informed decision about whether this funding is really going to have an impact. And distinguishing between risk and uncertainty can really help us to understand how we can best support decision making for NGO actors. We've learned quite a lot over the years. So the Start Fund obviously started for anticipation in 2016, as I said before. So we've learned a lot about how we manage uncertainty when helping members to make decisions. So the first thing we've learned is just because there is uncertainty, it doesn't mean we can't make a decision. Those decisions that we make should include recognition that there are elements of uncertainty. But as there isn't a right or wrong answer when you have this level of uncertainty, we have what we call a no regrets policy with the Start Fund. So even if funding is released to a situation that then goes on to not occur, we look for projects that generally have actions that could be considered no or low regrets, in the sense of what they're doing will also generally just improve the situation. So things like giving out medical supplies that could be used in any case, whether or not there's a cyclone. And this is one of the questions that we encourage NGOs to ask is, does the information that you have in front of you reflect the level of uncertainty? Are these NGOs thinking this might not happen, and what therefore could we do instead to make sure that we're doing no regrets actions? Learning is another really key point. So embracing the learning that occurs when we're dealing with uncertainty, looking at past decisions, seeing where those information gaps could have been plugged and how. Being guided by principles, so those principles that you had on the board, but also using expert judgment, so saying the coverage rate is maybe quite small, but my expert judgment in the past has told me that actually this would have a big impact. But then most importantly, and the point that I was making just before, is reducing uncertainty by increasing knowledge and verifying information is absolutely key. And being informed is really critical for decision making under uncertainty. So how have we taken steps to reduce that uncertainty in decision making? As I said, the Start Fund is unique. It's a pooled fund owned by and decisions made by humanitarian actors. And as some of you identified, it's hard to know or have that expertise. Like, one person can't have all of that information that you guys just outlined for every single country in the world. And when you're decision making about a global pooled fund, you can't retain that in your head. Humanitarian actors don't always have that risk analysis background that's needed to be making this kind of decision in a really informed way. So basically, we often require the advice and the expertise of actors who don't usually work with humanitarians. First of all, we try to triangulate information with third-party verification. So this is through a partner, ACAPS, but the briefings that they provide, they're often based on information that's already been published. So rather than giving that analysis and interpretation of the information, it's kind of just presenting that information, and it's only what's been published. And when we're operating in a very fast-moving situation, sometimes there's not enough detail available. The second way that we try and improve information is through Forewarn, which is the forecast-based warning, analysis and response network that we are building at Start Network. And this aims to bring together the right people to forecast hazards and to support the humanitarians closest to an anticipated crisis. This was established alongside the Start Fund anticipation window back in 2016, and it does support Start members to act in anticipation of hazards through the Start Fund by the global thematic subgroups, which have a technical advisory role to decision makers. So these are groups, they are hazard specific, so one for flooding, one for cyclone, etc. And they contain almost like a roster of experts in forecasting and hazard science and hazard analysis, modelling, groups of academics, and they're all relating, as I say, to different hazards. We contact these experts in an emergency situation when anticipation alerts are received to understand an expert analysis of the situation. And we're working towards being able to put members in contact with those experts during the warning drafting process. We also have national versions of these networks, so including national forecasters, national academics, etc. And we're working with partners to try and improve data availability to inform anticipation alert notes and to increase confidence in the decision making by working kind of outside of an emergency situation to improve the information that's available, inform alerts and support decision making. So I'm going to hand over to Alice now from Clear Global, who's going to talk a little bit about one example of the kind of expertise that comes from that cross-sectoral working. So we can't expect all the decision makers to have this expertise, but having the input of this kind of information can really influence decision making. So Alice, I'm handing over to you.
So my name's Alice and I'm a Programme Development Manager with Clear Global. And we're making a short intervention today to help you think through one other important factor across the many that you've been discussing, which we might build in when you are making decisions around emergency mobilisation. And this one is around language complexity and communication, which actually a few of you mentioned. So, before we get onto the content, I'm going to give you a very brief picture of who we are. Clear Global is an international NGO, and our mission is to help people get vital information and be heard whatever language they speak. And a cornerstone of our work is supporting two-way communication between responders and people impacted by humanitarian crisis. We do translation and language services, language technology, language mapping, which I'll be coming on to very much later, and research, advocacy, and tools and guidance and various services to support communication. So let's just start quickly with thinking about what are the basics of why you want to think about language in this scenario, and then of course in real life as well. So what we know is that language is a huge driver of vulnerability. And as a kind of humanitarian sector, organisations are used to looking at factors such as poverty and gender and age and disability as drivers of vulnerability. But language and vulnerability are interconnected, and speakers of marginalised languages often experience low access to vital services, barriers to representation, and very crucially in this case, barriers to information. So each driver of vulnerability will compound the next. We know across the world that poverty translates into low literacy and less access to the languages of wealth and power. In lots of societies, women, older people living with disabilities, and various other groups are likely to have less access to education, which means fewer chances to learn official languages, develop literacy skills, access technology, and the information that goes with it. So, an impoverished older woman with disabilities who speaks a marginalised language could be the very last person to be getting the warnings about an impending event, such as the one that you're discussing. And decisions about reaching her and other speakers of marginalised languages are going to be part of that complex decision-making process that you've been discussing. So, as you were just looking at a moment ago, the decision-making framework highlights that vulnerability is a component of risk and that that's part of the funding allocation decision. So, in this presentation, I'm going to look at what data there might be to help you in making that kind of decision, and also what might be some of the unsafe assumptions that we tend to rely on along the way where data doesn't exist, and how to mitigate and learn from these. So, if you're lucky, and you would be very, very lucky, but if you're lucky, the country in your scenario would have language and literacy data available to tell you more about the languages that people speak. So Pakistan, for example, has more than 70 languages, and a language map like this can show you the dominant languages in particular areas. Ideally, in a specific crisis, this will also be broken down by administrative district, like I've just shown there. And that overlays this information more broadly with detailed local information about the specific language of an administrative area and the literacy levels that go with it. And this can really help you not only to do the planning, but also to save money and focus the little money that's available to make sure communications material actually reflect the specific language needs of the alert. And that, with the full database that goes behind it, gives you a sound basis for decision making. So, for example, our language mapping in Pakistan helps challenge the assumption that the official language, Urdu, is sufficient, because in Rajanpur, for example, less than 2% of people speak Urdu, and the most common language is Saraiki. If you're lucky, again, language on data can be overlaid with language on common risks. So, and combined with things like telephone and radio coverage. So here you can see those kind of pieces of data combined with an overlay for Pakistan. And that can give you more insights about where mobile phones might be effective or not, and where text-based information might be effective or not, and where you will need to put more resources into reaching people by other routes. I said that you would be lucky if the data was available. In fact, you would be very lucky. Many crisis-prone countries have data which is outdated, or it's behind a paywall, or inconsistent, or difficult to verify, or just unavailable. And this leaves people in this decision-making position with a huge amount of uncertainty to manage. And that we have seen time and again is actually quite dangerous. So given that Apple country you don't know about, and that in real life you're unlikely to have the data that you need for your Ebola outbreak, I'm going to highlight just 5 important issues to be aware of when you're responding without enough language data. So, first of all, humanitarians in general tend to assume that most people in an area can speak a dominant language. But the data shows us time and time again that this is just mostly not true, and that affected people are much more likely to be linguistically diverse than humanitarians will assume. So communications for the 10th Ebola response in DRC were largely in French, gradually moving to Swahili as communicators struggled. And sometimes this was standard Swahili, and sometimes it was Congolese Swahili. Some organizations didn't realize the 2 dialects are very different. And as this map showed, French and Swahili were inadequate for local communication. And in fact, across the whole response, Nande was the largest, most significant language. So assuming certain languages would reach most people tend to lead to a significant lack of information, and then into mistrust in the messages. So where language data is unavailable, both in your fictitious scenario now and future real ones, we should assume high levels of multilingualism and prioritize getting data on the communication needs as quickly as we can. So we also know that failing to understand and address language compounds gender exclusion. Women are less likely to receive information. So in Cox's Bazar, for example, there was where gender norms really restricted people's access to, women's access to information and language. Having audio-based solutions significantly improved it. Cyclone Idai, for example, in Mozambique, the comprehension assessment found that women were much less likely to understand Portuguese, and that it was therefore inadequate as a language of response. And when we researched the recent flood communication in Pakistan from last year, we found that only a few men and no women from our research sample had received the early warnings. And when we played them the audio messages, our participants in Sindh and Southern Punjab agreed that those kind of audio messages would have been ideal if they had received them in Sindhi, Baluchi or Saraiki, depending on their mother tongue. And women told us that they were much less likely to own a telephone. The other issue is that organizations tend to assume that working through local partners or hiring local staff is enough to manage multilingual communication, but this doesn't actually tell us the whole picture. First of all, in multilingual or displaced communities, local staff may not understand the first language and understand the language needs of that community. Being from the same country doesn't necessarily mean having a shared language. And next, staff tell us that they almost never receive support on how to translate and interpret, because those skills are complex and tiring and time-consuming. Our assessments in Beni and Goma and North Kivu during the 10th Ebola outbreak in DRC showed that many people didn't understand the risk communication materials they'd received. As this first quote shows, the lack of information stopped people seeking healthcare. And community members told us they wanted information in a language they understood well and in a familiar style. They wanted clear explanations with enough detail about how the emergency was evolving, but health communicators often lacked those communication tools and the training, as the second quote showed. And in fact, they were given materials which, for example, consent forms for vaccines, which were in a mixture of high register Congolese, standard Swahili, Congolese Swahili, standard Swahili, and French and English, none of which languages were entirely suitable for the context. The next issue is that local level staff are likely to struggle to understand and to use guidance. So we did a multi-country study not so long ago, and there were two types of barriers that people faced. Barriers to physical information. So people really lacked time to read guidance. The costs were expensive to download it. The electricity supply was patchy, and there was an overwhelming amount of guidance out there. And then there were barriers to comprehension. The material was often in languages that people weren't comfortable with, used terms that people found difficult, and acronyms sprinkled all the way through it. They were in PDF format, which is a nightmare to navigate through a mobile phone, which is how most people were accessing it, and the guidance wasn't localized. So when people on the ground can't access or use the information about what risks they should be communicating or recommending to communities, then the mitigation strategies tend to start to fall apart. The responders from our multi-country study around guidance and also in our other programs consistently reinforce the need for short, accessible documents using plain language and familiar terms. So investing in plain language editing as public health guidance is commissioned can make a huge difference to how accessible it is and how much people actually are able to read and engage with the information that you're providing. Finally, it is tempting to believe that we can overcome a lot of these challenges with visual information, and it is really important and we shouldn't ignore it, but it's important also to recognize that it's not uniform. So colors and symbols are some of the many factors which we wrongly think of as being uniform to be understood. For example, red and yellow, symbolizing blood and money, fed conspiracy theories in DRC in the Ebola response, particularly where materials were already not in local languages. And ticks and crosses and arrows are not a uniformly understood set of symbols. Likewise, we often see assumptions about how the body is understood, how time is measured and expressed, how distance and weight are measured. And these concepts can be crucial when you're trying to communicate, for example, shelter construction. So, we have seen that communication is complex and multi-layered, and stakeholders all along the communication channel are likely to speak different languages and need different information. So failing to meet one point in that communication chain can have a snowball effect on whether the right information reaches the right people, and it's trusted and it's acted upon. So the first key funding priority for preparedness and for assessments of any kind should be the gathering of and collation of language information to support an informed communication strategy. Ideally, we should be working on this far in advance of an emergency to make sure language data for crisis-prone contexts is gathered and mapped. Where there's no data, we should assume linguistic diversity and the need for a wide variety of formats. It seems obvious to most organizations that you don't gather data and that you would always gather data and disaggregate by gender, but it should also be the norm that we do so by language. Making communications effective is clearly more complex than the simple scenario description of creating IEC materials in local languages. So if we know it takes effort and money to do it right, we should be carefully tracking what's effective and what's necessary and monitoring that effectiveness. So thank you very much. I hope this is a useful set of insights for your fictional scenario and lets you go ahead to consider thinking about this with this new information in mind. And in your real life scenarios, please feel free to reach out to us if you need some language analysis for your decision making. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alice. Hopefully you can still hear me. Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, hopefully everyone, that's given you all a bit more food for thought in terms of your decision making around the Ebola scenario that we were just talking about. And actually, hang on, if I can just, there we go. Along with that information from Alice, as Alice has been presenting, we've actually been reaching out to our 4-1 network of experts, and here is some advice that they've given you for making your decision. So, we've heard from someone based in Apple Country that actually there's a really high risk for Ebola to spread to Area 11 region due to frequent movement of people to and from Area 15 for cultural and trade reasons. So due to poor funding and a weak national healthcare system, contact tracing and sensitisation have both been really limited, increasing the likelihood of cases surging. Secondly, an epidemiologist, sorry, struggle with that word, has flagged to us that Ebola outbreaks often tend to start with a series of bursts in cases. And this is due to a long serial interval, which means that days or weeks of quiet might occur, followed by sudden new clusters of infection. And also because Ebola has a high propensity to super spreading, so the number of secondary cases that arise from primary infection is actually very variable. So a small number of primary cases give rise to very many secondary cases. Thirdly, we've heard from a communications expert that myths around risk perception within affected communities is a really key challenge to preventing transmission. But access to radio is limited in some locations, and communities might need to be engaged through more traditional means, like road drive campaigns and during market days. So I'm going to ask you now to go back to your groups, reflect on this additional information, think back to your original scenario. Has your decision changed? What are you thinking now about whether or not to allocate on the basis of this additional information? I don't know how to actually get back and have both on the screen at the same time, so hopefully you can remember the original context well enough. Yeah, go ahead. Sure, yeah.
When you get this secondary information, can you guide the decision of how the funding will be used? Like, do you provide guidance to the NGOs?
So we would provide this information and we can facilitate the conversation, but the decision is made by the NGO decision makers. Yeah. Great. So off you go. Discuss. Great, okay, everybody hopefully has had a chance to think a little bit about their decision making. I'm just going to bring us all back slowly. So has everyone had a chance to reflect on this new information and kind of think a little bit about decision making? It looks like a yes. I'm just interested to know, did anybody change their decision? So whether you went from yes to no to yes, like, please, can you raise your hand if you changed the decision that you'd originally landed on? Oh, that's not the result I was hoping for. No, but it's fine. I think, okay, so can I ask about why you decided to change your decision? Maybe, I don't know if, do we this? If anybody wants to.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'll come next.
I think it was essentially, it came down to a question of if the money wasn't spent at this point, the cost of it spreading further would be too great not to. Even though there were plenty of questions still to be answered, we just felt that risk was too great.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
So I raised my hand because we didn't have an answer the first time. We only landed on we need more information. So we did make a decision this time, and we were leaning much more toward funding now. And one of the big pieces was about this, the cost effectiveness. You know, you were talking a little bit about whether or not, like the no regrets piece, about whether or not the activity that's being funded is something that's going to have a value, whether or not the outbreak actually happens. And I think that swayed us, along with number 3, you know, really looking at the cost effectiveness of the funding. There seemed to be much more of a case for it, given that new information.
Great,
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I might be an outlier here because I changed my decision from a yes to a no.
Okay.
Sorry. I just, number 3 is really critical to me, and I maybe have some hesitancy with not being able to have any control over the NGO's messaging and actual actions if people don't have access to radio. And how are we supposed to know that the funding will actually go to creating awareness? You know, will they take road drive campaigns? Will they go door to door, household to household? And I just think there's more critical, and it would be great to know what kind of messaging is within the awareness campaign. Is it on how Ebola is being transmitted? Is it on, just, you know, I still need more information, and I Money needs to go to contact tracing. Money needs to go into PPE, especially if there's a weak health system. So I'm really not sure about awareness campaigns, and the radio is really going to be successful. Sorry, and I just had one question, if I can. I wanted to know, when you do give funding to NGOs, do you have, I really appreciate the no regret kind of approach, but I wanted to know, is there any post-disaster evaluation or post-funding evaluation of how that money was spent and the effectiveness of that funding?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks. Great question. So each of the NGOs will submit more detailed proposals after. So if this was allocated, it would then go through to proposal writing and proposal selection stage. And any awarded NGOs are then, so that would be probably where some of that detail would come in once they were actually applying. So this is just raising information about the crisis and saying we need some money for this, and then proposals will be raised to give the details of the exact activities. Each of those funded NGOs would then submit a report at the end of the project with details about what was done, how many people were reached, what the impacts were, that kind of thing. And we also have a learning exchange with them, so we'll meet with them, have a call and discuss kind of what the project achieved and that kind of thing. Any learning that came out of it. But great question, thank you. At the back, yeah, go for it.
So, it's just interesting to hear this and reflect on the session that happened in this room just before. I think some of you were in here, and we spent the hour and a half talking about what makes for a really robust communication strategy and what elements you need to have in there, and all of the considerations about reach, language, but also how you're having conversations with the population to have a very active communication strategy as opposed to an information push strategy. And so it's interesting to think about it from the funding angle and what you're funding, and to think about it not as communication versus something else, but rather how do you communicate really effectively, how do you measure the impact. And I think if we're all just savvier about the questions and about how we examine communication that's proposed, we can really expect, I think, more robust campaigns and more effective campaigns. And I think the point about measuring impact is critical also, so that we know what does work and under what circumstances, we can keep feeding that into future strategies.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, and I think there was actually a question after the initial discussion when we first came back about, if it's just communication, what are we spending all this money on? And I think hopefully, like Alice's presentation and this reflection has also helped to think about, actually, there's quite a lot. It can be quite an expensive thing to do. People see it as a low-hanging fruit and a quick win, but there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into it. Yeah, thanks. Any other reflections on changing your mind or not? Where did this extra information take you? Yeah, go ahead.
Just one question, like how...
Sorry, I think maybe if you can just for the people online.
I'd just like to one more piece of information. How many applications? So this is for 2 months, right? You have 750,000. How many applications do you typically fund in a 2-month period over what kind of amount? So what's the opportunity cost?
Sure, great question. Yeah, thank you. It varies depending on the season. So obviously a lot of hazard seasons will kind of arrive at the same time. We can see between 2 to 7 alerts in a month, usually. In a week.
And how many of those do you tend to find?
Again, it completely varies. I don't have the statistic off the top of my head. I think, our activation rate is at the moment, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but it's, I wouldn't even like to guess it, probably around 50%, maybe a bit higher. We've had a very busy year for kind of activating these alerts this year. So. Anybody else like to reflect on? So I guess maybe also just thinking about how your confidence in making a decision changed upon receiving this information. Did it make you feel better about the decision that you were making, or did it just kind of provide more questions? Hopefully it increased your confidence. And also I think just reflecting on what I was saying before about uncertainty, it's never an exact science and there is no right and wrong answer. It's really about looking at trying to make sure you've asked the right questions and then identifying, yes, there is a gap here. What do we do to mitigate that? Just maybe in conclusion for the last couple of minutes. At the Start Fund, we do try and bring together all of these pieces. So we have the humanitarian expertise in the room. We also try and bring in some of that technical expertise around hazard analysis and modelling. But in general, we try to bring them together to release that funding within 72 hours of receiving a warning. As you've seen through this exercise, it left you with lots of questions, but having access to the right information is really essential, having that quickly as well. And also generating data ahead of time really helps to reduce the uncertainty when lead times are short. So keeping vulnerability data up to date, mapping language, as Alice mentioned, and also just understanding what your access is like. And then finally, working collaboratively with hazard experts can really mitigate uncertainty in human decision making around risks that we can't model or we haven't modelled yet. So hopefully this, in general, will enable more anticipatory action funding to be released for those 50% of hazards that do have the potential to be forecast, even if we can't be modelling them. Maybe just as a final note, just to mention that we are always actively looking for academics and risk analysts who are keen to join our network and would like to be involved in providing this kind of information to decision makers. So if you'd be interested in getting involved and you kind of make that profile, feel free to come and talk to me or just drop an email to forewarn@stopprograms.org and we can get you involved. But great, thank you very much.